And Joe, after looking at our top three most pleasant surprises for the Flyers this season, we're going to look at three biggest disappointments. We'll go 3 to 1. Let's start at number 3 for you, Joe.
Well, number three, I'm gonna say that the whole goaltending scenario was a disappointment, and I'm not. I was not disappointed in Sam Ersson.
Yeah.
You couldn't be. Just the way that the whole scenario played out, in the sense that I felt like it was the strength at the beginning of the season. Everything happens with Carter Hart. He takes his leave of absence, and then it turns into this situation where I feel like by the end of the season, people were blaming the goaltending. And the disappointing part of it to me is that too many times in my lifetime, the goaltending has been blamed for this team not making the playoffs or not doing this or not doing that. No one expected this team to make the playoffs with the goaltending situation intact. So I will say I was disappointed in the fact that that became somewhat of a scapegoat because of everything that happened with Carter Hart, and then Sam Ersson. You can argue whether he had to play too much. We know he never played as much as he played, and John Tortorella brought that up several times. So it's not like we're taking that out of thin air. Everyone acknowledged Sam Ersson played too much, and the reason he played too much is because of everything that happened with Carter Hart taking his leave of absence. And then you have Felix Sandstrom, who we kind of know what he is, borderline NHL goaltender, and then of course the situation with Ivan Fedotov at the end of the season. So I'm going to say the goaltending situation, and in no way is this a knock on Sam Ersson. It's just a knock on the fact that it became the scapegoat when it was the strength of the team. I'm even saying, I mean, when Ashland talked to Danny Briere near the end of the season, Danny was talking about how Ersson was pushing Carter for starts even when Carter was there. So this is not about Sam Ersson. It's about the fact that I don't like that the goaltending became a scapegoat, an easy sort of thing for people to go to, because the reason this team didn't make the playoffs was not because of the goaltending. I
No,
don't think.
I totally get that. And there are so many questions with this Flyers rebuild, questions across the board, but you thought the one answer they had probably was in net. They still had a franchise goalie at a good age who was already established and really looked like they had that crucial position kind of nailed down. And then poof, Hart is gone because of the Hockey Canada sexual assault case, and now they have significant questions at that all important position. And I still think it's one of the biggest questions as far as position groups going into next year, is because Ivan Fedotov, we have no clue what he's going to be like at the NHL level, and Samuel Ersson, we don't know quite yet if he's a number one, if he's
Yeah,
a number
he
two. We
hasn't
don't know.
had to go into a season as the starting goalie yet.
Right.
And I mean, you could argue we saw some wearing down near the end of the season. He was playing a lot. He, of course, said he wanted to play all the time, but every player is going to say that. So, you take all that stuff with a grain of salt, but we don't know what this is going to look like when he goes into camp as the number one goalie. And quite frankly, with an uncertain backup situation. So we're talking about, does he play 65 games? I mean, is that the expectation? Because that's a big jump from last year, and that would concern me if we're going in and we're saying, okay, you're going from the backup goalie to we need you to play 65 games, or I mean, more would seem insane in this NHL, but you just don't know how that's going to affect a guy. So to me, that's got to be that's on my list, and I'm going to put that at number three.
Yeah, and it feels like a cloud just kind of hanging over the Flyers for what if they get everything figured out finally at forward, defensively with coach, management, but then they don't have an answer in net. I mean, it could set them back even more. You see teams that finally get answers and finally take the next step, but then they're spelled, or I should say, soured by goaltending. So yeah, that's a very fair one, Joe. I'm gonna go number 3, Rasmus Ristolainen. I think that was an under the radar kind of disappointment because you had some of the ones that really popped out, like Cam Atkinson, Sean Couturier, guys that actually played, but didn't really have the seasons I think people were hoping. Ristolainen, for me, there was so much promise going into this season because everyone talked about how he was learning how to defend with smarts and strategy, learning how to hit and defend with those qualities under Brad Shaw, and it looked like there was a lot of promise going into this season. And then this is a guy that played only 31 games because of two separate injuries. The second injury required surgery this offseason, the ruptured triceps tendon, and he's making their second most money defensively if you exclude Ryan Ellis. Only one defenseman is making more than him, and it's Travis Sanheim. So a guy making 5.1 million a season, and he only plays 31 games. To me, that was disappointing. And in 3 years here, he has not started a season healthy. He has not played in a season opener. 3 seasons he has been banged up going into the year. So I just think that's been disappointing. It's a guy that really I thought we were starting to get some answers with him in terms of a defenseman he could be at this level. And to not even play half the season, I just thought was a disappointment, Joe.
Yeah, I think going into the season, the Flyers counted on a good bit from him, and the reason why was the previous season, you could argue he was the best player over the last 20 games of the season. Now, I mean, that was a team that was bad.
Mm-hmm.
So you take that for what it's worth. But his defensive game was there. You mentioned him cleaning up the discipline, kind of like an effective way to hit and play a physical game without taking penalties. That was a big step. And we even saw his offensive game take a little bit of a step forward to the point where he was playing on the power play. And they had him sitting in front of the net on the power play sometimes, which obviously a big body like that is, that's a good net front presence if the guy has hands to work with there as well. So I agree with you that that's a disappointment for sure. I mean, he was, to me, at worst, the second pair defenseman that you could count on. And you mentioned he played 31 games. I got to say, that number even surprises me because it doesn't seem like it was 31.
No, it does not. It's true.
So he just really wasn't a factor this season. And that hurts because then you're playing guys that maybe aren't regular parts of your lineup. And then you're bringing guys up. And then if somebody else gets hurt like Jamie Drysdale did, you're dealing with that. So it's tough when... If you lose a top 4 and you're not expecting to lose one of the top 4, that always creates a problem, and it certainly did with the Flyers this year because I think there were games where they really missed his physicality because a lot of the guys they have playing in their top 4 that when he wasn't there, they're not the most physical defensemen. So I think they missed that aspect in a big way.
And then you think, on top of it, with this rebuild, everything being on the table, he wasn't really even a trade asset or chip for them. He couldn't be when he's hurt. And we've talked about contending teams probably coveting guys like him just because of his physicality and his
right,
in-your-face
and that was
style.
with the assumption that he was going to be playing.
Exactly, and the fact that he wasn't playing and couldn't even be used in that type of way, I think makes it even more disappointing. Celebrity cook Steve Martirano brings his Italian-American cooking back home to Philly. Enjoy Martirano's Prime at Rivers Casino and Steve's famous meatballs with Sunday gravy, prime steaks, and more. Make reservations for Martirano's Prime on Open Table. Joe, number 2, biggest disappointment. Who is it for you?
I'm going to say Cam Atkinson.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because we came into this season and it did kind of it did kind of trend this way, but not because of Atkinson. We talked about how you get these veteran offensive players back in Couturier and Atkinson, and it kind of settles things down. But Atkinson just really never found his game this year. I don't know if it was lingering from the injury, and then, of course, John Tortorella having him in and out of the lineup, out a lot of the times later in the season. A player like Atkinson is not going to get going if they're not playing. And they're also not going to get going if they're playing really low in the lineup. He's kind of, we mentioned this with Morgan Frost before where, there's certain types of players where if you play them, you're not going to play them on the fourth line because they're offensive-driven players, and Atkinson's one of those guys. He's a former 40-goal scorer in this league, and we just never saw that. We saw it for that one stretch of games, and that was really it. And the best way I can describe it is just puzzling.
Yeah.
Puzzling why in the first part of the season he couldn't find his game, and then in the second part of the season I mean, there was some lineup decisions where you'd find yourself going, okay, this guy over Atkinson, or are we just sending a message here? And a lot of times, I think it felt like the message, sending a message, as opposed to putting the best lineup with a chance to win, because at the very least, he's a threat to score in the lineup. And there was a lot of guys that were not threats to score
Yeah.
late in the season in the lineup. So I'm going to have to say Atkinson.
I also had Atkinson, number 2, and I really don't think it's like a lack of effort or care. He's an accomplished guy, a really good locker room guy that I think's done a lot in his career. I really think so much of it was the layoff that he had and really the severity of that injury for a guy his age. Neck surgery that I know really put him through a lot the season prior, emotionally and physically. And then at his age, I believe he's 35, 34 or 35, and yeah, 34, and he turns 35 next month. So just that type of injury for someone at his age, at this phase of his career, I think really wore on him. Joe, if someone told me he would go on separate goal scoring droughts of 26 games and 23, I would have said no way. I'm sure I would have expected him maybe to have some stretches here or there, maybe where maybe he struggled to score because of the layoff and the injury, but I did not think he'd go 26 and then 23 to finish the season. And I definitely didn't expect him to be a healthy scratch towards the end of the year and playing on the fourth line. If someone told me that at the beginning of the season, I'd be like, wow, I just wouldn't have pictured that or envisioned that. And he does make the second most money among Flyers forwards. So he's a guy with money on his contract, and now I think he's going to be a big decision for the front office, whether he has played his last game as a Flyer or not. So Atkinson, number 2 for me. Number 1, Joe, how about you?
So, number one, if we're going by individuals, which I think this exercise really is, I know we talked about the goaltending, which is not really an individual, but it's a position. I'm going to say Noah Cates because I feel like his game. You could not talk more glowingly about a player than John Tortorella talked about Noah Cates 2 seasons ago. And I felt like this past season came on at the end a little bit, but for a good majority of the season, I don't feel like Cates was a noticeable player in games. Not noticeable for the reasons that he needs to be noticeable, and that is playing both sides of the ice. I mean, for long stretches, there was virtually no offense. And I don't know. To me, when you're playing center and you're not noticeable in a game, that's trouble. You need to notice a center, and I don't know. I think the way he played the year before and how the coach talked him up, I was expecting a lot more, and it just didn't happen. Now he came on a little bit at the end, so maybe that's good, building momentum into the next season. But I think my expectations for his ceiling probably dropped this season, based on what we saw, because he wasn't noticeable enough for a guy that really, I mean, the way he was talked about was he was a top 6, which means he's at worst a second line center. I don't think he played like a second line center for 90% of the season.
Yeah. Yeah, he even said at his exit interview, I found it interesting. He said early on he kind of had like an identity crisis with his game because everyone knew, well, wow, the defensive principles are there. And I mean, he had garnered kind of Selke Trophy buzz with how defensively sound he was. So he thought the next thing for him was offense, offense, offense. And I think when he wasn't scoring, he started to think, well, what am I? What should I be at this level? I really think he started to figure it out towards the end. But it was kind of too little too late, just given the gap of games he missed because of his injury. And Danny Briere even mentioned in his exit interview that Farabee and Cates were 2 guys that they think can be better, can take on bigger roles, and didn't quite develop the way Briere thought. So that's a really good one.
Yeah, I mean, Farabee's an example to me of consistency that plagued almost every player on this team.
Yeah.
It plagued Konechny.
Yeah.
I mean, a big reason why the end of the season struggled was Konechny was in a drought.
Yeah.
And if Konechny's not in a drought, I'm not sure you're losing games to Chicago and Columbus if the guy you're counting on to score scores, and he didn't. But Cates is part of that group, but that needs to find, and Tippett is part of that group, needs to find consistency within their game. And those guys got consistency for the most part in the lineup. And usually when guys are inconsistent on teams that are borderline playoff teams, you can find the cause for the inconsistency is that it's inconsistency in who they're playing with. That was not the case for a lot of these guys we just mentioned, and they still had inconsistency plaguing them. So that's definitely something that has to get better. And a young team, that's what you expect. It comes with, you know, guys growing their game. Consistency comes with it, or it doesn't, and then they're not top six forwards. So I feel like that is a number of guys, but especially Cates this year. There was, I would say he was, the part of his game that was consistent is not the part you want to be consistent.
Yeah.
It's not being noticeable, and if you're getting noticed, it's for the wrong reasons, and I think there was far too much of that this year.
The Flyers have a ton of guys in that 24 to 26-year-old range that I think have shown upside, but the Flyers are still trying to figure out who they are going to be at the NHL level. Like, there's a ton of them. I think Case is a big one. I think next year is going to be really telling for a lot of those players. Like, the years are going to start to pile up on the rebuild, and these guys are not getting younger. And the Flyers need answers of, like, okay, what is this player's ceiling? We can't just keep saying there's more there, and then it just never happens. I think Cates is going to feel some pressure of, all right, I got to stay healthy, and I really got to start to kind of carve out my role here. Same with guys like Farabee, Tippett, Zamula. The list goes on and on. Frost, you can just rip them off. Cates is going to be one of them. Joe, my number one goes back to kind of what you had was goaltending, but for me, it's just Carter Hart specifically. I know it will come with an asterisk of he played well before he had to take a leave of absence because of the sexual assault case, and then he didn't play. But, I mean, it's just so disappointing on so many different levels that this guy was your franchise goalie. He was very much established and looked like he was going to be a big answer to this. And then you see how close they were to making the playoffs, and if they had a little more stability in net. And really, I thought they were playing their best hockey when Hart and Ersson were going back and forth and kind of almost swapping games. Like, they were a really tough team to beat. Their goaltenders were staying fresh. So for me, it's Carter Hart. Again,
And then like when he takes his leave, it was like he vanished into thin air.
yeah,
It's like you almost forgot he was part of that
Yep.
at any season, part of the team at any part of the season. But the results show you,
Yeah.
and it's just it's a circumstance that is obviously unfortunate on so many levels, way beyond sports.
sure.
But it absolutely affected the team, and you don't. And I'm not just saying we talked about Ersson having to play more. There's got to be a mental factor. So I think all of that played into that was just a huge hit to take in the middle of a season.
Yeah.
Especially a season where I mean, there were stretches of this season where it looked like they were going to coast into the playoffs.
Yeah.
And it just came apart for a variety of reasons, but that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, and it's really just disappointing on the big picture level that he might never ever play for the Flyers again. I mean, I'm sure there's a real likelihood that
I
he
think
might.
there's a good chance he's not going to play.
He's not going to play for the Flyers again.
Because you don't hear anyone talking about the if or when he comes back. That
Right.
It's just not being talked about at all.
Right.
And I know there's legal issues, but I mean, really, I feel like if you read the tea leaves, we're looking at Sam Ersson and Ivan Fedotov going into next season.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, do we even know? Like, we don't know what the legal outcome of this is going to be. And where's Carter Hart's game if he doesn't play hockey for
That's
X amount of time?
Right.
You know, and in no way are we saying the hockey's the most important part, but it's a hit when you have a player that's playing at a high level and he's just not there anymore in a position like that. To me, I thought the Flyers did better than I would have expected if you would have said before the season, here's what's going to happen. He's going to take a leave in the middle of the season, and it's going to be like, poof, he's gone.
Yeah.
And Sam, it's all on Airson and backups that are borderline capable of playing, once every couple of weeks. I would have been surprised they were this close to the playoffs. I mean, they were essentially a win away from the playoffs. If
Yeah.
they would have beaten Chicago or Columbus or one of these games that looked like gimmies, and they didn't. And there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, but one of them is certainly the goaltending situation.
And John Tortorella mentioned at one point in the season that they had known something maybe was down the pike with Hart. So you really can tell when they were, they're drafting 2 goalies in the draft. Second, they're trading up in the second round to grab one. Then they're taking one in the third round. Then they have Alexei Kolosov, who they were high on. And, of course, we have Fedotov now in the picture out of nowhere. You could tell they were starting to prepare for maybe life after Hart. But I think it doesn't really sink in or hit until suddenly he's gone. And the Flyers have just a significant question at the most important position in the game. So
Right, and because of the nature of the situation, nobody wanted to talk about it. So
Yeah.
you really never got to the bottom of how it affected this team
Mhm.
because no one was going to talk about it. I mean, we didn't want to talk about it. We just kind of reported the facts that were out there and just moved on because there was really nothing else to do. Besides address his absence from a team perspective and really the depth of their goaltending. But it's just really an unfortunate situation on so many levels.
Yeah.
Namely the alleged victims.
Yeah.
And then just the trickle down from there. I mean, you never want to see this happen. And, the Flyers were left to pick up the pieces. And I think they picked them up pretty well based on the scenario they were handed. I don't think there's that many teams in this league where you could take the starting goaltender out of the mix for I'm just saying for any reason, not for this particular reason, but take them out of the mix for whatever the reason may be. Most teams are not going to survive that.
Yeah.
And I thought this team did. And, as Danny Briere said, Sam Ersson was pushing to be the starter before Carter's departure. So he did show the promise, and we saw him play great stretches of games. It looked like he kind of ran out of gas near the end of the season.
Yeah, and maybe he'll be more prepared to play games of that magnitude and that number going into this season. Maybe it just caught up to him because it happened so quickly in the middle of a season. Now it's going to be interesting to see how he handles it going into next season. Really kind of pegged as the number one, the guy that's going to start on opening night, how he trains, how he prepares for it, and if the Flyers can help him a little bit more too by trying to spell him throughout the year in a more stable situation. And it's no doubt an awkward position, I think, for the Flyers when it came out that Hart had to leave and the reasons why. And it'll probably be somewhat of an awkward situation and distraction, until the trial is over with. And
whenever the
and
outcome
we don't know
is,
when it's going to happen.
It's not something that anyone is looking to address from a hockey perspective because it would seem insensitive to talk about it in a hockey perspective.
Sure.
And that's why when we talk about it here, we really just this is not the big issue is not that he's not with the Flyers, but we are also here to talk about the effect on the team.
Sure.
And it certainly had one. So whenever the time comes where, the legal matters are behind them, I'm guessing they're still not going to want to talk about this because it's just not saying something doesn't do them any good to talk about it. It's obviously a disappointment, both in the alleged behavior, the effect on the team, all that stuff, and even the prospects of all the hype that was around this guy when he first came up.
Yeah.
And he was resurrected as the guy that was going to save this franchise, bring this franchise back, and solve the goaltending problem that really they've had at different levels since Bernie Perron. I mean, there's in my lifetime it was Hextall, but then there was always the susceptibility to the big goals with Hextall. And then it was countless others.
Mhm.
And we heard a lot of times Sergei Bobrovsky comes up. And then they move on from Bobrovsky to sign Ilya Brizgalov. He doesn't work out. And it's just, we've heard that this is the guy, this is the guy, this is the guy.
Yeah.
And it finally seemed like this was the guy. And that's not how, it doesn't appear that's how it's going to play out.
Yeah. So definitely, a disappointment on many levels. It's definitely Carter Hart, but also the goaltending, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast. That it's a big question, and certainly a disappointment that it played out the way it did. So a lot to address over the summer, and we'll continue to think of topics, Joe, and have topics, and we'll continue to answer all the big questions I think facing the Flyers this summer. But good to address the disappointments, good to address the pleasant surprises in our previous podcast. You can check that one out wherever you get your podcast. But Joe, thanks so much again for doing this. Great to see you. Great to chat with you. A big thank you to Ben Berry, our podcast producer and guru. And of course, for us Flyers fans, thank you so much for listening to the latest Flyers Talk podcast. We were live at Rivers Casino in Philadelphia. Wherever you get your podcast, please rate and listen. And we cannot wait to talk to you next time.